All right, we're going to get started. So it is my pleasure to welcome Dr. John J. Klein, call sign Patsy, who is a senior fellow and strategist at Falcon Research and an adjunct professor at George Washington University and Georgetown University, which we will not hold against him. He routinely writes on space strategy, deterrence, and law of armed conflict. He's the author of several books, including Understanding Space Strategy, The Art of War in Space, Space Warfare, or excuse me, The Art of War in Space, Space Warfare Strategy, Principles, and Policy. And today he's going to be talking about his new book, Fight for the Final Frontier, Irregular Warfare in Space. Patsy is also a retired commander in the United States Navy, received his commission through the Navy ROTC program at Georgia Tech. He served for 22 years on active duty as a naval flight officer, primarily flying the S-3B Viking. Patsy supported combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. His tours included executive officer of Sea Control, Squadron 24, and the final commanding officer of Sea Control Weapons School. Patsy holds a master's degree in aeronautical engineering from the Naval Postgraduate School, a master's in national security and strategic studies from the Naval War College, and a PhD in strategic studies from the University of Reading in England, where he studied under Colin Gray, one of the most eminent figures in modern strategic studies. Patsy is a distinguished graduate of the U.S. Naval Test Pilot School. He has over 2,700 flight hours in 27 different types of aircraft, and he has done over 600 carrier-arrested landings. So it is my distinct pleasure to have you up here today to talk about your new book, one of our own. Thanks.
Afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. This is going to be a casual type of event, so there are some snacks that have been set up. So if you need a break, stretch your legs, get some coffee. That's understandable. I am going to quote dead people, which could be a snooze fest. So I think the coffee is definitely in order. Some of you may have come out here because you saw this cool book cover saying Irregular Warfare in Space and say, what is this going to be about? So maybe a leap of faith of sorts. Maybe nothing really came to mind when you saw the title, but we'll go through some of the details on what that means. So I think I have the best job. My day job is I get to write service level space policy and strategy by day. I get to teach some wonderful students space policy and strategy at the undergraduate, doctorate, and graduate levels. And then whenever I'm awake, I'll still write about the same thing. So from sun up to sundown, sometimes dreaming about it, I'm thinking about space, which I think is pretty cool. I'm gonna keep my comments to about 20 minutes. I want to frame some of the discussion. I think that's helpful instead of going right into it. But if you do have questions, anything that pops up, feel free to engage me at the time. I want to thank the Space Policy Institute and the Elliott School for letting me speak here today. All right, so I've been writing on space strategy for about 20 years now, which I guess classifies me as seasoned at it. My first paper was called Corbett and Orbit, came out pretty much 20 years ago to the month. It used maritime strategy as an analogous framework to think about space strategy. Sir Julian Corbett was a renowned strategist, academic in Great Britain in the early 1900s, a contemporary of Alfred Thayer Mahan. That paper was about 15 pages. It turned into the genesis of my first book, which basically carried on. So the first two examples over here are what was known as Corbett and Orbit. My second book, Understanding Space Strategy, if you had to call it anything, it would probably be called Corbett is Not Enough. So it introduced a lot of the concepts from Clausewitz, Sun Tzu, Thucydides, B.H. Littlehart, J.C. Wiley, and other strategists. Think about it. And this latest effort is why we're here. When I did my previous writing, Corbett and Orbit and Understanding Space Strategy, something was always nagging at me. It just didn't really seem to fit. So Clausewitz writes about major force-on-force engagements. You had some of, even when you take Thucydides and a lot of Sun Tzu, the context seems to be major force-on-force or armed conflict. But a lot of things that we've been seeing for the last few decades wasn't that. So how did I kind of reconcile these enduring strategies that we always look to, whether it's air power theory, sea power theory, and how does it apply? So we were seeing, direct ascent ASAT testing, jamming and lasing pretty much every day continuously, cyber attacks against space architectures, whether it's the ground segment, debris generation, hopefully not purposeful, but that's questionable. And then also some of the coercive effects of rendezvous and proximity operations. So this wasn't conflict, this wasn't war, but it was things that were on people's minds. So that was kind of the genesis. Hey, is there a better way to think about it? Instead of doing domain analogies, which is my bread and butter with Corbett and Orbit, maybe the answer lied into it's a mode of warfare we're seeing, in this case being irregular. All right, so first question is what is irregular warfare, or how am I defining it? Because yes, everyone in this room what definition is, and you'll probably get 20 different answers. So irregular warfare is apart from major conventional wars against an enemy who takes a similar approach. Big spoiler alert, using this definition, irregular warfare is not an irregular occurrence. Most conflicts that we have had in recorded history had elements of irregular warfare. Sometimes it was elements of regular and irregular. So that's just something a lot of people confuse. Well, if this happens all the time, we really can't call it irregular. Yeah, by definition, you can. And some of you may be doing eye rolls because I've just defined irregular warfare as the opposite of regular warfare. And in strategic studies, we do that routinely. We have the indirect approach, the direct, the asymmetric, and the symmetric. So but this is the definition that we're using going forward, and that'll help the context. So good news is we've known about irregular warfare for some time. We've just called it many different things. So asymmetric warfare, sometimes counterinsurgencies, gray zone operations, gunboat diplomacy, from James Cable, terrorism, Charles Caldwell called it small wars and the like. So the idea has been around for centuries or even millennia in one form or another. So that's good, is that we can look to the past to kind of provide some insights. All right, so first thing is so given this definition of irregular warfare, what would be some examples of irregular warfare in space? We have ongoing GPS jamming in Ukraine. We have cyber attacks against computer related networks, proximity operations. We have a role of proxies now with commercial companies in Ukraine. So, Putin that says, I see SpaceX's Starlink as an extension of the United States. So we have these ideas of proxies and proxy war, which is also a part of irregular warfare. All right, so just for, this may seem like science fiction, but I think it's a good point of reference. You told me what irregular warfare is. What would be some examples of regular warfare? So this would be, by definition, major force-on-force engagements. I would say direct ascent, hit to kill, ASATs that target GPS would be a potential contender. Kinetic kill vehicles against exquisite intelligence collection assets. Space-based lasers causing permanent effects. And then, of course, everyone's favorite rods from God, which are tungsten rods, theoretical concept. You deploy them from low Earth orbit. Depending on who you ask, you get maybe a 1 KT, 2 KT of damage. Arguably, you could call that a weapon of mass destruction, which brings up the Outer Space Treaty. Sometimes folks like me are part of the problem when we talk about regular, irregular warfare. We like to bend and categorize things. It's this, it's not that. We do this in deterrence theory by parsing that out too. But I want to give this quote by Robert Gates, who was actually paraphrasing Colin Gray, I found out. So when thinking about the range of threats, it's common to divide the high end from the low end, the conventional from the irregular, armored divisions on one side, guerrilla toting AK-47s on the other. In reality, the categories of warfare are blurring and do not fit into neat, tidy boxes. So what I'm presenting here isn't to say, hey, the answer is irregular warfare. It's going to be a mix and match of both a high and low end. But I think it's an important framework to at least consider as we develop strategies and counter strategies for the competition that we're seeing today. So let's get to what is this going to do for me? So one of the phrases that we're seeing in the news, we have Sandra Irwin and Teresa Hitchens' articles up here. The Chief of State's operations has talked about competitive endurance. We're talking about competition with China, competition with Russia. So The good news is irregular warfare, at least as I'm laying out here, and this idea of competitive endurance are two sides of the same coin. I don't use this term in the book. I started writing this book about 2.5 years ago. So this term wasn't in vogue at the time, but uh, had I had the opportunity, I would have included. So let's take this one apart. Competitive endurance, it's competition, it's not conflict. Okay, so that's implying this is something below the threshold of armed conflict. And endurance um, connotes the protracted or the temporal dimension. This is not a discrete event, so it's actions happening over a long period of time, and that's classical irregular warfare. So as you study this, the solution to competitive endurance is your counter strategies based on irregular warfare. So I say this routinely to my classes and I write about it. So space is not special, just wonderfully different. And what I want to get from there is, when I was writing probably about 8 years ago, I got this sense that some of the folks in the community had absolutely lost their minds. So everything was new. This was a new way of thinking. We've never seen this stuff before. No, we've seen this stuff before. We've seen it in other domains. So let's at least acknowledge that millennia of experience, strategic experience, the writings of classics, we can at least have something to learn. This book and what I've trying to present here is not meant to be an academic exercise. If it doesn't have a practical value, it's pretty much worthless in a strategic sense. So it needs to provide answers. And my last chapter, I try to go into that. Another way of paraphrasing this, space is not special, just wonderfully different. If you want a new idea, read an old book, right? So again, I'm going to quote dead people. We're going to refer to some old books, but I think that's good at least to say, hey, we know this, problem in other ways. So let's apply it from there. And then we're speaking of old books. Right. So Sun Tzu's Art of War, over 2,000 years ago, he wrote about a variety of things. Including achieving the most gain for the least amount of effort, which is classical asymmetric warfare, deception and surprise, attack the enemy where he or she is unprepared. So those ideas that we know about. P.H. Littleheart, probably not taught as much as Sun Tzu or Clausewitz, but when he wrote his book Strategy, The Indirect Approach in 1967, and some of his writings before, it was supposed to be a direct counter to Clausewitz. Force on force was the solution. This idea of total war, which was theoretical according to Clausewitz, but he was really dismayed by the amount of carnage that major military conflicts had. So he says, how can we win? How can we achieve our objectives without fighting? And to that was the indirect approach. So should not seek solely to overcome the adversary's resistance, but rather should exploit the element of the indirect approach that was apart from direct major force on force. So using the indirect approach, even though he didn't express it this way, movement and surprise, asymmetric attack, third-party proxies would be a contender. Anything below the threshold of armed conflict. Another writer, J.C. Wiley, wrote another book in 1967 called Military Strategy, A General Theory of Power Control. He talked about two things. One is the sequential strategy. So like in the Pacific campaign in World War II, you had leapfrogging where you had to have one success and you needed that success before you had your next success. So you couldn't get to that future success without all the sequential successes prior. The other part is a cumulative strategy. So this is the minute accumulation of small successes, which by themselves are all inconsequential, but over time can lead to strategic advantage. So you could say examples are intentional distortion of the law or lawfare, coercive actions like we're seeing in the South China Sea and elsewhere with these artificial features and trying to upset that. So also referred to as salami slicing. You can call it some other analogies too. All right, so most seminal warrior about a writer on irregular warfare, Mao Zedong. There's a picture of him on the Long March in the mid 1930s, fighting with and invading the nationalist under Chiang Kai-shek. So his strategy was definitely elements of a protracted or cumulative strategy. Just try to fight for another day, attack, retreat, drawing in some of the writings of Sun Tzu. But he wanted to protract the war until the situation changes in one's favor, includes using either non-military or military actions. Where are we going? Another topic that comes up, at least inside, the services, is this idea of, again, for competitive endurance and first mover advantage. So most conventional thinking is, and we've had general officers refer to big, fat, juicy targets. So we have very vulnerable satellites in orbit. Whoever attacks them first has the advantage, as the thinking goes. But what does the US do about that? Sometimes people say, well, if we're going to try to handle first mover advantage, or this idea of second mover disadvantage, maybe the United States should attack first. I don't see that as a very plausible. War and conflict is mostly a political decision. We could talk about anticipatory self-defense under, sometimes called preemption, whether there's a legal basis for that. But even if you had the best intel on the threat assessment that attack was imminent, and you had no other choice but to attack, I think just the reality of the politics of it, it's unlikely, or at least unreliable. So what can be done? We do this all the time. So it's a deterrence by denial of benefit. We know, the United States and Western liberal democracy should not be the aggressor. So we are probably going to be attacked first, at least kinetically. There's measures we can take. So how do we mitigate this? So unlike boxers in the ring, we have two folks at the county fair here. Say it's me and Kevin, and we're in the suits. We're not going to hurt each other. Okay. Unlike, the boxers, we're going to just get hot and sweaty and just get tired. So deterrence by denial of benefit is you take measures where no matter what I do to Kevin, I'm not going to hurt him. He's not going to hurt. So in the space community, we call this space mission assurance and resilience. It includes, defensive operations, reconstitution, resilience under disaggregation, distribution, diversification, proliferation, and deception. A long laundry list. Great work that Doug Lavera wrote in 2015 on that, which we still use. Clausewitz talks about this idea of the defense being the stronger form of action. He talks about making preparations. So again, this is making preparations. The US is going to be the aggressor. It's probably going to take a blow, at least initially. What do you do to mitigate this? That's what. All right, so my chapter 5, I talk about lawfare, which is the intentional distortion and misuse of legal regimes for competitive advantage. Charles Dunlap coined the term in the 1990s. He was kind enough to give a review of the chapter, make sure, but again, this has to go with how can you achieve competitive advantage? Again, distorting legal regimes. It would be a separate discussion if we talked about, has the United States ever distorted legal regimes, but we'll hold that for another time. But for case in point, so we know China and Russia through the PPWT, I won't give you a long name, but it's Prevention Placement of Weapons in Outer Space. For a lot of folks, that's classic lawfare. So it was like, we're going to try to limit or hamstring the United States capability with on-orbit space capabilities, but we're not going to include the terrestrial launched direct ascent ASATs. Lawfare, at least in Chinese and PLA writings, is also classified as legal warfare, is meant to raise doubts among the adversary or other neutral military civilians and the broader population. And we see a lot of this in the South China Sea, this just erosion of what we understand. Even taking the court has had limited results. So this is my model for strategy. A strategy is balancing ends and means. So lawfare, or the distortion of legal regimes, is just one means to do so. All right, so we can alternately call this slide, so what? So I've presented a whole bunch of stuff, quoted dead people, but big question, okay, so what does this mean for outcompeting China? So this is the last chapter in the book. I don't want to give away the baby in my discussion, but I just want to highlight here. So these are 10 ideas. Some of them, if you read them, they'll say, well, that's obvious. Well, that's good because it's based on millennia experience, but some of them may not be as intuitive. What's shaded here in the upper part, the blue, those are non-material solutions. So we don't need to develop anything. We don't need to field a new system per se. A lot of those include training, education, new strategies, changing our outlook, non-military solutions, working with allies and partners, and planning for a range of potential futures. In this town, we routinely there might be organizations that like to predict or forecast the future and give you a single dominant solution. If you just do this, you don't have to worry about competition. So you need to plan for a range of potential futures because the future is unknowable in any detail. That was a fire hose. But we'll open it up for questions or discussions. We can talk about the book. We can talk about writing, teaching, whatever is on your mind. But first up is Kevin, I'm sure. So putting you on the spot.
So you mentioned about lawfare. So how's the United States do anything?
To do anything to counter? Oh yeah, you got to talk in for the.
So this is Kevin talking about, you brought up about lawfare in the United States. Has the United States ever used it for legal?
Used it in our sense?
Yeah.
Some folks say we have. I'm not good. It's kind of outside the realm, but there's the lawfare blog. If you go to hit that, they'll give you some pros and cons of examples of cases where they claim that we have. One thing that we touch on lawfare and the defensive strategy is, and the cumulative strategy works, which lawfare is part of. If you do nothing, you lose. So you have to respond to lawfare. You have to respond to cumulative approaches. Otherwise, in 20 years, 100 years, you have lost because someone else has the strategic advantage. So even lawfare has to be countered. Something I suggest is offensive-minded approaches to counter. So it's not saying I'm going to build a weapon or go after the maritime militia that's harassing Filipino fishermen, but we need to have measures in place, whether it's norm setting, other international legal regimes to take away freedom of action for our potential rivals, at least in the legal domain. Thank you for that. Nico. And Jose, I'm coming to you.
Great.
Thank you very much. Great discussion. As part of our asymmetric advantage in a competition with China, how does commercial enterprise play into this competition?
Short answer is huge. So on both sides, one thing I highlight is United States and our allies and partners. One of the strategic advantages is our commercial sector. We have the best innovations. We protect intellectual property. We're still a country of choice for a lot of these emerging space companies to come to, which is good, and we want to keep it that way. But the role of proxies is key. The idea of force for hire goes back thousands of years. So that's what does that equate to space? Well, we see private military companies, whether it's a Wagner group in space or the like. But it shouldn't surprise us. The United States should expect its rivals to go after our commercial and for political reasons, and they'll call it whatever they want. They'll distort a legal regime or come up with whatever. But for the U.S. and its allies, we need to get a handle on what is our comfort level with going after potential rivals. I understand the PLA, CCP's version of commercial is very different, but they are still for profit, even though they have tight linkages. So that needs to be a discussion in peacetime, whenever conflict.
Dr. Klein, thank you for the brief. My question goes, if in your research, were you able to identify any success stories of irregular warfare, either on our side, Chinese, or two different bodies, where they took on some of your lessons that you're presenting, some of the recommendations where there was an application so that you could go to a like item in history?
Yeah, I would say the easy one, at least in the land domain, is insurgencies and counterinsurgencies. So this is, if you're starting off from a weaker position, you harass, you attack, you fight another day, and over time, you hope the situation changes on your.
So let me jump on that for a second. What you're offering is more than just that. You're offering an institutional rethink on how we approach irregular warfare. So when those recommendations were spot on, and where it took me to was the thought of how informally people learn about cyber, how young people find different ways to utilize how that is. And, I'm trying to think of another time in history in where industrially we were doing the not so kind things or irregular things. Automotive development, how in the 40s, 30s and 40s, the development of Ford against the other companies. I share that because what you're offering for a recommendation is actually pretty profound when you're able to look back and go, whoa, cyber is an opportunity where we saw people being educated and on their own create their own mental irregular warfare. And I think it would be very healthy if that carries over into space, meaning there may be things that young people are thinking about or that organizations are thinking about that are not even related to space that they can apply. But this is great. That's what it made me think about.
And the other, I'll just amplify. I would say the American Revolution.
Yeah.
George Washington was classic. He wasn't fighting, lining up his guys abreast.
Or learning that it had to be bigger than them and had to come up with different ways.
And for the space domain, I would say, cyber attacks.
Yeah.
It's an asymmetric approach, very low cost, potentially big items. We saw that in the lead up into the invasion in Ukraine, cyber attacks against Viasat. I would also say, back to Nico's item, using commercial provide military capabilities. Commercial as a proxy is also part of irregular warfare. So I think we're seeing that too.
Yeah, no.
And I see it only getting more so. Scott.
So on your last chart, you talked about defensive operations, okay, embrace defensive measures and space resilience. Okay, how about offensive measures? 0, one example, massive force, how much is enough? That kind of question, because we've been down that policy path before about purely defensive measures and resilience. And yet there's other stuff, as you know, that says having some offensive capability can be stabilizing, if dangerous.
So thanks for that one. Routinely, I write about the Clausewitz defense being the stronger form. Okay, so I will stick to that. But what sometimes I don't hit enough is you can't get rid of offensive means. You can't, in this case, you cannot get rid of having space weapons. It's just called for what it is. You need to have a way, whether it's deterrence by punishment, you still need the way of that element of deterrence. I like deterrence by denial of benefit a lot, just because, the China, the CCP, Russia, and the United States and Western countries, we have different versions of deterrence. We have different worldviews. So China's is more compellence. Russia is unacceptable consequences. Ours is more dissuasion. So given that mismatch and some of the stuff that we did in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, we tried to guarantee deterrence by our nuclear capabilities, like doing this numbers game, like, okay, well, we got them, and now that they're deterred. So I like the denial of benefit, the mission assurance and resilience, because if you can convey the futility, you're also there. But to your point, we need offensive means. Deterrence by punishment and denial of benefit are interrelated. Again, you really can't segment them. And that's all mutually supportive. So spot on. How much is enough? I don't have an answer to that, but you do need it. I would say, if I had to pick, which do you need more of? And I think we're seeing that now. Proliferated constellations, commercial capabilities. That's a lot, but you're going to need some type of offensive capabilities. Now, the problem is, on the US side, you like to classify everything, but as we know in the Dr. Strangelove movie, if you don't tell anybody about it, deterrence by punishment doesn't work so well. So you just keep.
Wanted to pick up on that, I wanted to pick up on that sort of, you reveal to deter, you conceal to win, and whether you think those concepts are applicable in the context of irregular warfare in space.
Right. So reveal, conceal. If I had to pick one, I'm a reveal guy. The conceal, there's no guarantee you are affecting the decision calculus of your rivals. Or if you are, there's no guarantee you're affecting the way you think. Ambiguity, chance, and uncertainty, those are part of conflict. I don't like adding to it necessarily, but I think the reveal, you don't have to say everything. And you can, what hiding in plain sight means for space is something that we need to figure out too. But I'm a big fan of reveal, conceal. I see limited value. Okay. Sorry, you had a question?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
And how much of if there was some actual war in space, how much of it would be direct impactors, that I guess China and probably everybody has tested at this point? And if there were even more than a few dozen of these things, wouldn't it put clouds of space junk out there that would end up taking down a lot of other satellites, like in the movie Gravity, which is really wonderful to watch. But things going at 5 miles a second aren't visible. You're not going to see them. And just for like an incidental question, if you know, what is orbital speed at geosynchronous altitude? How fast is that?
I am not, Nico, do you know the orbitology at Geo? Okay, we'll have to get back to you on that one. I don't have that.
That's about 8,000 miles for 17,000 Leo, 8,000 miles an hour.
Okay. So I'm going to answer your question. So this idea, I kind of like highlighted what irregular warfare in space looks like and what regular warfare would look like. I think this is kind of like saying what we're seeing for the last few decades is more irregular. What you were mentioning, hey, we're going to go bust up some stuff in space. Kinetic impacts, large debris generating systems. So that would be more regular force on force. Hopefully we don't see that because of the point you mentioned. So lines of communication in space are very similar to lines of communication in the maritime domain. They're shared. So if I take away your access to space and you're able to use it, say in Leo through proliferated constellations, maybe I take away mine too. So we have, I see limited utility in debris generating weapons. Now that's not to say some folks don't care. We have to plan for that too. So some folks, hey, let's take everyone back a few decades and we'll just take space away from everybody. We do have to plan for those too. But I think your comment's more on the regular side, and that would be more kinetic kill vehicles, lasers, direct descent ASATs blowing up or destroying GPS or other high value assets.
Thanks, John. So I had a question. Did you ever consider like the escalation dynamics or escalation ladder for irregular warfare, especially concerning commercial providers serving as proxies when, the launch industry were wholly reliant on commercial space to actually access launch. Whereas, on orbit, we do have national assets. So you do have that escalation dynamics on, we can target commercial because it may or may not be more escalatory. And I was just curious if you thought about that or wrote about that in your book.
I talk about the escalation ladder as far as how the PLA is their escalation ladder for deterrence. And then I talk about the security dilemma a little bit, which is different what I think you're bringing up there. But my caution is, again, to worldviews. What our idea of cost and benefit is going to be different than what the CCP's cost and benefit is going to be. So if we say, hey, I'm going to escalate and I'm going to impose cost on their commercial, well, if their commercial is intertwined with PLA assets, we really doing what we think. So I didn't do that, but that's a good point though. And I look forward to your paper on it. Here.
So can you talk a little bit about the relationship between information warfare and irregular warfare as applied to space? Because if we look at the Chinese example, strategic support force of use, space, cyber, EW is one informationized space. If we're going to talk about cutting off SATCOM, that just seems the latest iteration of trying to mess with telecom infrastructure, which would be traditionally called IW. So what's the line between irregular warfare and IW in the space domain?
It's the short answer, they're very blurred. So, you know, Dean Chang and others, you know, informationized wars under local conditions or some paraphrase there. So information dominance is key to PLA strategy. But it's going to be, whether it's in the legal warfare, you know, they'll talk about their three warfares, but it's going to be intertwined and at times the same. And something I didn't bring up, something that I'm mulling over, you know, because because the space domain includes the space architectures and the ground segment, at times cyber warfare and space warfare can be one and the same. And I think that's something that we really need to explore more and understand there's this interconnection. So it's so involved, I don't think we have a good answer. And I think CCP's version will be different than ours. So I talk about it tangentially, but it's important. Please, sir. Oh, sorry.
Thanks. My question was kind of related, and I don't know to what extent you can answer this, but to what extent is American space infrastructure vulnerable to cyber attacks, and what would be the consequences if those vulnerabilities were exploited? Thanks.
Okay. I won't talk about vulnerabilities in a specific sense. US is, but when you look at the history of cyber attacks and what folks want to go after, whether it's critical infrastructure, you know, we have to make sure that we protect in general through cyber attack. When I talk to commercial companies like Viasat and others providers, they're under cyber attack every day, hundreds of attacks. And so some of their counter cyber techniques are more advanced in a lot of countries, because if a cyber attack works and they're not making money, they're out of business in this market. So it's important. I'll answer it this way. I think the ground segment is the red-headed stepchild of the space domain. Everyone forgets about the end user and the ground segment, but that's key because most of the folks that are going to be using it are here on Earth. So, but the good news is cyber attacks are happening all the time. And fortunately, there's not, occasionally you get a news story that something happened, but it's rarely as many attacks that happen, very few times that it has a significant impact. So, but it's something to look out after. Please.
Yeah, I just wanted to get your general take on something in the public international law sphere, and specifically regarding prevention of the proliferation of weapons in space. We've seen some modest success limiting certain types of weapons under international treaty regimes. The chemical weapons ban comes to mind, and the whole treaty and infrastructure that goes along with that. Modestly successful. We've also seen some gains in the development of the doctrine of a global commons, specifically thinking of the Antarctic Treaty. Who knows what might happen to that as time goes on. But what I really want to know from you generally is if you're optimistic or pessimistic that some developments could happen in international law, creating a treaty regime which would help to reduce proliferation of weapons in outer space.
So I'm going to answer, unlike how I do in my classroom, I'm not going to say it depends, but I will say in the context of your question, I'll say I'm pessimistic, but it's pessimistic in the sense of it's not going to achieve what we think it is. So, we'll just backtrack on the Outer Space Treaty. Peaceful purposes, it does prohibit nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction.
Stationing permanent.
Yeah. And I think is it stationing? So I think we have that, but what is a weapon? We have with the China and Russia's PPWT, you have some folks who want to say it's just space weapons, but US delegation through State Department say you can't just exclude space to space, you have to include the terrestrial component there. In this world that we live in, getting a treaty through the international community, especially through the UN, I see as unlikely. I think the Outer Space Treaty was successful just because of the time and place. The United States going to the moon, a lot of questions about claims of sovereignty and the like, and didn't want to see the Cold War extend to the moon. So I think it was just a different time and a place. I am on the hopeful side. I think the voluntary ban on direct ascent ASAT testing is good. If you see DoD's tenets of responsible behavior, we're trying to limit long-lived debris. So these debris generating event, let's at least start. We may not agree on everything. At least start like, it's not trash the space domain for centuries because some folks were acting irresponsibly. So do I think we're going to see competition in the space? Yeah. Hopefully it'll stay reversible and non-kinetic. And I think there's folks who believe that, but I do look to the past to kind of foreshadow what's going to happen in the future. So something big. Keep that. Thanks.
Perfect segue actually into this question.
Sure.
Do you see norms as being a useful component towards an effective deterrence strategy, whether through national or international implementation? And if so, how?
Okay. So I do talk about norms a lot. It is a in vogue discussion on the irregular warfare side, and especially on the distortion, the lawfare. So forming norms that are counter to what the United States and its allies, I think, is something that we need to be cautious of. You don't promulgate a policy and set a norm. So norms take time. International, there's rights and benefits. Sometimes it's established in international treaty law, but it needs to be enforced and the like. But it is important. And I definitely see it distorted. But I'll go back to the commercial sector. The commercial presence right now eclipses most governments. Starlink, I think, has most of the satellites up there. So these standard business practices over time are going to establish normative behavior, which may turn over to norms in more of a legal sense in time. I'm hopeful that we will do it responsibly. Big question is, I love the Artemis Accords in the program. The one caveat is I have some concerns over safety zones, what that constitutes. So if you use the incidents at sea agreement as a thing with safe and professional, I understand, but I just see so much potential distortion on who decides what a safety zone is, how far it is. Are you setting up de facto keep out zones and the like? Did that come close to answering your question? I think I kind of rambled on it.
In addition to incidents, law of the sea, I would also look to actually ITU practices. We handle geoslots all the time, and we've gotten to a point where that's not a claim of sovereignty yet. We have professional operations, so it can go either way. The question I had actually goes back to your Navy experience. I'm trying to remember where you were during the tanker war, 86, 88. So we carry out punitive strikes against Iranian sites that were shooting at Kuwaiti tankers that we had flagged. Fine, all well and good. But later we lose in the International Court of Justice, I think 14-2, that rejected our claims that we were, acting in self-defense, that we should have suffered more damage than we suffered before justifying that attacks. And so I kind of see a direct parallel between the tanker business and flagging commercial spacecraft that we then take either space to space or space to ground or ground effects against. So should we practice lawfare now preemptively to defend ourselves? Should we simply ignore the International Court of Justice and tell them to pound sand? Should we, get an agreement with other allies as to how we're going to do it? Because past precedent on defending commercial assets actually on the seas is not really great for us.
Thank you for that question. So to answer briefly, no, I do not think we need to practice lawfare. I'm not a counsel or a lawyer. I do get to have the occasional guest speaker come in and we practice it in some war games. So as explained to me, U.S. interpretation, there's one component that a lot of our European allies do not include, and that's this threshold or gravity of the situation. So we have the inherent right of self-defense and anticipatory self-defense in there, but we don't set a threshold. It has to get to a certain point. And I think that was the case that was brought up through the courts. Like the situation wasn't grave enough for you to respond to. I think we've been consistent in that. We don't recognize gravity or a certain severity for inherent right of self-defense, but we have to understand a lot of our allies do. But no, I don't think we should practice it. And I think we need to at least present ourselves as the good guys. We're not going to do intentional distortion, but we have to recognize that our rivals will have a counter for that. So I think that helps a coalition form better if we at least can agree on that. We're not going to at least purposely distort them, but we're not going to agree on everything. I think they say we're not going to have a common understanding, but a shared understanding. We just need to work this out in peacetime on what we consider acceptable or not.
Yeah, I just did this work with the allies. I'm from Korean National Defense University.
Actually, the South Korea is at the very primitive state in its military space strategy. So I introduced some kind of concept to the ROC Joint Chief of Staff. In that idea that was your the two books. And my question is that how will South Korea-US alliance respond to the threat of gray areas from China or the North Korea with the risk-taking tendency? So together, and can we distinguish between China and North Korea threats, or what role will the US expect from South Korea? Thank you.
You know, I'm optimistic on some of the recent dialogue with South Korea that we've had. We'll go back. So 2 strategic advantages on how we outcompete. US outcompetes its rivals, allies and partners, and commercial. So whether it's working in war games, expanding our space operations, our combined space operations, that is important. And I think we're recognizing that. I think there's some interest in getting South Korea involved in some of the US national security war games in the future and the like. I don't really talk much about North Korea, given their mixed record. There are no irrational actors. Even we may disagree, but that is a range of potential futures that the West needs to plan for. Well, you know, a ballistic missile capability, is that a space asset at what time? But it's something that is on my mind, and especially since they have nuclear weapons too. But it's very important for the U.S. and its allies, and for the folks in the region. We're not talking, I don't think containment's in vogue, but whenever we say Japan and South Korea and what areas we're interested in, that's what pops to my mind. Thank you for reading those other chapters.
So the bullet point, be flexible and adaptable, is really standing out to me quite a bit. Do you think it took about, I don't know, 10 years for the US to change its approach on, developing its architecture, from the discussion of disaggregation to actually, making use of commercial space with proliferated architectures, and where SDA and SWAC have proposed their missile warning architectures kind of going, you do see that, adaptability to the threats. And I was just wondering, do you think that the DoD, because of the bureaucracy that it is, and changing bureaucracy is very difficult and slow, do you think it's even at a point to where it can be flexible and adaptable to the evolving threats? And then the second question I had, and you can tell me just to read the book if you answer this in the book, is do you think the United States is in a good position to actually outcompete China?
Okay, we'll answer the second question first. Yes, I think US rivals, China and Russia, would gladly trade places with us for our space capabilities, our systems. So let's not, I know when we go to the Hill and justify budgets, we're talking about different threats and stuff like that, but as it is today, we can talk about if the gap's closing, we exercise a lead. And I think we should, it's not just happenstance, a lot of hard work went into that. Flexible and adaptable, we'll go back to this, hey, this single dominant solution is going to save the day. Right now, what's in vogue is proliferated LEO, right? So mission assurance and resilience is more than proliferation. It can be non-space solutions. It can be other ways of doing it, working through commercial companies. you can say it's hybrid architectures, but before everyone goes after proliferated LEO as the answer for deterrence by denial or dissuading our rivals, it's much more than that, and we should open up our aperture on what that entails. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Oz. Isn't there any possibility for cooperation with China in the future for the US? Because everyone talks about the competition, but US has been cooperating with Russia from since the beginning, even today.
Yes. So one thing I find in my classes and probably on how I teach is the realist school of international relations always comes down. Everything is a competition. So there is room for cooperation, and I think you're seeing some of it. It is challenged by some of the rhetoric and world events, but debris generation. I think back to Scott's point, spectrum management is international cooperation as it is through the ITU, ensuring deconfliction of spectrum. I'm optimistic on space exploration and samples and science and stuff like that. So that's the easy ones. But these ideas, we know what we don't want the future to look like. We don't want to trash LEO with a bunch of debris, whether it's kinetic or accidental. I personally think we need to get a handle on how folks are going after LEO. Do we need to have an ITU-ish type of thing where we start trying to divvy up the altitudes? Right now, it's the countries are doing that through their licensing agreements, but it's unsustainable, especially if you have competing interests. So yeah, there are areas. Russia's a fantastic example. Geopolitically, it's one thing, but we still find a way to cooperate in civil space, despite the occasional rhetoric too. So I am hopeful, but whatever reason, the realist school always seems to get the most play. So thanks for that. Please.
Hey, thank you very much for your valuable insights and the presentation. So my question is a kind of a follow-up question. So within the context of pursuing non-military solutions, so we were talking about realist school and stuff. How would you approach the United States recently published Space for Diplomacy and Diplomacy for Space approach within the context of strategic framework for space diplomacy? So if there is even a less possibility that we are somehow using diplomacy at this point or in the next stages, I don't know. What would be the points that diplomacy would potentially serve pursue non-military solutions? Thank you.
Diplomacy is key and has been key. We do have measures that go in front of the United Nations, whether it's through the OEWG and others. So we try to make progress there through its, the ban on direct descent ASAT testing, trying to get folks to buy into trying to limit long-lived debris. So it is essential, and it's not going to go away anytime soon. It's easy to concentrate on the military or the system solution, but a lot of these non-material solutions are going to have a strong diplomatic element on that. So that needs to be acknowledged. It could be the soft power, it can be diplomacy, information, and economic too. So I would look for those to help you with some of these non-military solutions. Hopefully that came close to answering your question. Thank you.
Anyone else? Yeah, sure. All right, Patsy from Rebecca Cohen Hirsch. She wants to know what suggestions you would make to maintain political and domestic support for operations in space when the specialness of space is not widely understood.
Was it what sanctions?
When the specialness of space is not widely understood in the general public and among a lot of legislators, how do you actually maintain support for space operations, political support?
Thank you, Rebecca, for that question. And I'm going to answer it maybe not the way you wanted it. So I did 22 years in the Navy. Most of the American people don't know what the Navy does. They think we just go from port call to port call and the like. So, educating the American people. Sometimes the Space Force says, hey, we have our culture, the American people don't understand. We have people making fun of us through Netflix and others. Like, welcome to the club. Okay. I can point to all the other services and sketch comedy and the like. So that's part of the normalizing process. How do they know that it's not special? Just wonderfully different. I'm not sure we'll teach that, but I think we can emphasize the cool stuff. James Webb Space Telescope. I get really excited when we're doing asteroid sample returns and the like. So let's highlight the good things that the science and exploration, and celebrate when India gets on the south pole of the moon, and we can worry about the competition, the realist on what we're going to do with all that water ice, right? It's a mad rush for water ice on the moon, but it's okay. And I don't think we need to worry about that necessarily, because we muddled our way through in the other services too. But thank you, Rebecca. Well, thank you all for coming out today. It's been a wonderful discussion. Some questions I've heard before, others I have not. So thank you for that. You'll have a good day.